Alcatraz was one of the most secure prisons of the 20th century. Just looking at it is enough to send chills down your spine. People believed that escaping from it was simply impossible. Yeah, try to tell that to these men. Somehow, they proved to be smarter than the entire prison system and managed to disappear from the most infamous prison in America. According to FBI files and the recollections of former prison guards, only one of them, Frank Morris, was believed to have an IQ of around 130. Today, I want you to look at this legendary escape from a completely different perspective. But before we begin, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Alcatraz is the kind of place that still feels disturbing, even today when it's just a museum. Just look at the conditions people were forced to live in. A standard cell was tiny, an iron bed, a small desk, a sink, and a toilet. No comfort, no privacy, nothing extra. But the most terrifying part of the prison was D block, where inmates were sent for serious violations. Imagine spending 14 days locked inside a dark cell with almost nothing around you. No furniture, no light. Sometimes all you had was a bed and a toilet. And all the while you knew you were surrounded by hundreds of armed guards and some of the most dangerous criminals in America. Men who could kill you over the smallest mistake. The message was clear from day one. You weren't there for a vacation. Total control, isolation and constant psychological pressure defined life inside Alcatraz. Alcatraz sat about a mile and a quarter off the coast of San Francisco, not far from the iconic Golden Gate Bridge. At night, inmates could actually see the light of the city. Some even claimed they could hear music and voices drifting across the water from the mainland. Freedom was right there, just within sight, but completely out of reach. Just listen to what former inmate William Bill Baker had to say about the prison.
Alcatraz was a maximum security federal prison. And the worst part about it to me, or to most people, was that you were locked in your cell most of the time.
Baker was arrested for stealing a car when he was only 18 years old. After that, he escaped from prison several times, and because he was considered such a high escape risk, authorities transferred him to Alcatraz.
I went there for escaping from other prisons.
Years later, after serving his time, Baker regularly returned to the island as a guest. He talked with tourists, signed books, and shared stories about what life inside Alcatraz was really like. Now, let's take a look at the men who actually managed to escape this place. Here they are, from left to right: Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. They weren't notorious mob bosses or famous serial killers. What made them dangerous was something else entirely. They were intelligent, disciplined, patient, and incredibly cold-blooded. Take Frank Morris for example. He had earned the nickname the Escape Artist. Before arriving at Alcatraz, he had already escaped from several different prisons. Federal authorities eventually decided to transfer him to the one place they believed was absolutely escape-proof. What they didn't realize was what he was truly capable of. If Frank Morris was the brains behind the escape, many historians believe that John Anglin was its heart. His story is actually a rather sad one. John grew up as one of 13 children in an extremely poor family. Together with his brother Clarence, he spent most of his criminal career robbing banks. Unlike many criminals of the era, they weren't known for excessive violence, although armed robbery was, of course, still a very serious crime. After several escape attempts from other prisons, John was also transferred to Alcatraz. According to former guards, he was surprisingly quiet, polite, and well-behaved. Hardly the kind of man you would expect to become part of one of the greatest prison escapes in history. As you have probably already guessed, Clarence Anglin was John's younger brother. John was born in 1930 and Clarence followed just a year later, in 1931. They grew up together, robbed banks together, escaped from prisons together, ended up in Alcatraz together, and, according to official story, escaped from it together. As soon as they arrived to Alcatraz, one of the guards reportedly looked at Frank Morris and asked, "So, Morris, do you think you will ever escape from here?" Morris looked around the island for a moment and replied, "Maybe, but they haven't built a prison that can hold me." 3 men who had spent their entire lives chasing freedom had just been sent to the one place that was supposed to break them for good. But instead of accepting their fate, they began planning what would become one of the boldest prison escapes in American history. But how did they meet? And how did they come up with such a brilliant plan? The answer is actually pretty simple. All three of them were housed in the same cell block. Their cells were right next to each other. They ate together, worked together, and spent time together in the prison yard. But why exactly these three? Frank Morris was the kind of man who probably wouldn't trust a plan like this to just anyone. He needed people who wouldn't panic, wouldn't betray him, and knew how to work with their hands. As you have probably guessed by now, the Anglin brothers were a perfect fit. There was also a fourth man involved, Alan West. He helped prepare the escape and work alongside the other throughout the planning process. But when the night finally came, West never made it out. Ironically, he would later become the man who told the FBI many of the details about what had happened during the famous escape. Now let's take a look at the layout of the prison itself, because understanding its design will help us understand just how incredible their escape plan really was. That is what Alcatraz looked like. At first glance, it might seem like just another prison, but every part of it was designed with one purpose in mind: to make escape practically impossible. For example, this was the main entrance, the point where every inmate first arrived. A series of massive security doors made it virtually impossible for anyone to leave without the staff's permission. So, if you were thinking about escaping through the front door, that was never really an option. Here was the prison library, a place Frank Morris visited on a regular basis. Maybe it was his constant desire to learn and improve himself, even in a place like this, that helped him see what nobody else could. Over this was A block, one of the least used sections of the prison, where inmates considered relatively less dangerous were held. And this was B block. This was the main housing area, and more importantly, it was where Frank Morris' cell was located. It was from this very block that the most famous prison escape in American history would begin. But the most terrifying place on the island was D block. This was essentially the prison solitary confinement unit, better known as the Hole. The most troublesome inmates were kept there in near total isolation. So, how do you escape from a place like this? It was a question that had haunted prison for decades. Then, one day, Frank Morris noticed something unusual. Behind the thing in every cell was a small ventilation grill. For most people, it meant absolutely nothing. But for the man in our story, it represented an incredible opportunity. Behind the grill was a narrow utility corridor. The problem was that the opening in the concrete wall was far too small for a person to squeeze through. When Alcatraz was originally built as a military prison in the 1910s, the concrete around these ventilation openings wasn't reinforced particularly well. After decades of moisture and salty ocean air, it had begun to weaken and crumble. Morris noticed it. Removing the metal grill itself wasn't especially difficult. The real problem was that the steel wasn't enough space for a human being to get through, so they decided to make one. But that immediately raised another question. How do you dig through a prison wall without anyone noticing? At first, their tools were incredibly simple. They chipped away at the concrete using ordinary metal spoons stolen from the prison cafeteria. Surprisingly, they worked very well. But eventually, spoons alone weren't enough. So they came up with something far more ingenious, a small homemade drill. According to the FBI's official investigation, they built it using an electric motor taken from an old vacuum cleaner, scraps of metal, and stolen electrical wiring. It was crude, but in the hands of Frank Morris and Anglin brothers, it was exactly what they needed. But that raises an even bigger question. How did they hide the noise? In my opinion, this was one of the prison's biggest security weaknesses. Every evening, inmates were given a period of time when they could listen to music. Morris and the others took full advantage of it. They did most of their drilling during that exact window, using the music to mask the sound of their work. The concrete debris wasn't a major problem either. They removed only small amounts at a time, so it never attracted much attention. The prisoners simply hid the rubble in the pockets and gradually disposed of it throughout the prison, dropping it in the yard, in service areas, and anywhere else they could get away with it. Little by little, day after day, the hole grew larger. And somehow, nobody noticed what was happening right under their noises. But even if they managed to get out of the prison itself, that still wouldn't solve the biggest problem. They were surrounded by freezing water. There was no way they could simply swim more than a mile through the cold currents of San Francisco Bay. They needed a raft, so they decided to build one. Their solution was as ingenious as it was unlikely. They used around 50 rubber raincoats. At the time, inmates were issued these raincoats, and over the course of several months, the group slowly collected enough of them for the project. They couldn't use them together with thread. Finding something like that inside a prison would have been nearly impossible. Instead, they used a far more creative method. They bonded the rubber together by heating and sealing it, using steam and heat from the prison's pipes to fuse the material into a waterproof raft. By this point, the openings behind their sinks had become large enough for them to squeeze through. They regularly climbed into the utility corridor behind the cells, where guards almost never looked, and it was there, hidden from sight, that they secretly assembled the raft that would eventually carry them away from Alcatraz. Finally, when everything was ready, they decided to make their move on the night of June 11. For the guards and the rest of the prison, it seemed like an ordinary day. All four men attended dinner. Until around 9 p.m., they behaved exactly as usual. Nothing seemed suspicious, nothing seemed out of place. Eventually, everyone returned to their cells. At around 9:30 p.m., the escape preparations began. Inside their cells, the prisoners placed fake heads on their beds, creating the illusion that they were asleep. About 30 minutes later, Frank Morris made the first move. He removed the ventilation grill, squeezed through the opening, and entered the narrow utility corridor behind the cells. Not long afterward, the Anglin brothers joined him. But what happened to Alan West? He had planned to escape with them. However, at the last moment, he discovered that the opening behind his sink wasn't large enough. Desperately, he tried to widen it, but it was already too late. By then, precious time had been lost. Nearly 30 minutes had passed, and Morris realized that the waiting any longer would only increase their chances of being discovered. They had no choice. They left Alan behind. The three men continued through the utility corridor and made their way towards the roof on the prison. This was one of the most dangerous moments of the entire operation. They were now completely exposed beneath the open night sky. One loud noise, one mistake, one shot, and the guards could spot them instantly. But somehow they made it across the roof undetected. After climbing down to the shoreline of the island, they began the final stage of their escape. They pulled out the raft and started inflating it. Even that took time, roughly 30 minutes. But after months of preparation, every risk, every night of digging, every piece of the plan was finally paying off. And then it happened. Three men climbed into a homemade raft and disappeared into the dark waters of San Francisco Bay. What do you think was happening inside the prison while all of this was unfolding? Absolutely nothing. Until the following morning, neither the guards nor the other inmates had any idea that three men had escaped from the most secure prison in the United States. At 7 a.m. during the routine morning count, a guard approached Morris' cell and saw what appeared to be a prisoner sleeping under a blanket. Everything looked normal, but when Morris failed to respond, the guard reached out and touched his head, only to discover that it wasn't a head at all. It was a fake. The alarm was raised immediately. Within minutes, the entire prison was on high alert. Chaos erupted across the island, and what would become the largest manhunt in Alcatraz history had officially begun. At first, many believed the escapees were still somewhere on the island. But after searching every corner of Alcatraz, investigators came to a startling conclusion. They were gone. When patrol boats, helicopters, and search teams were deployed across the bay, authorities began finding the first traces of the escape: a homemade paddle, life jackets, pieces of the raft. From this evidence, investigators reached what seems like the obvious conclusion: the men had drowned. But there is one major problem with that theory. No bodies were ever found, not a single one. And if they really had drowned, where were the bodies? That is the question that has fielded debate for more than 60 years. Maybe they actually made it across the bay and lived out the rest of their lives in secret. Or maybe they were swept away by the powerful currents of San Francisco Bay and lost to the water forever. Nobody knows for sure. Years later, members of the Anglin family claimed they received postcards and messages suggesting the brothers were still alive. Two mysterious men rapidly appeared at the mother's funeral, leading some family members to believe they were John and Clarence Anglin. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. So, what do you think? Did they successfully escape Alcatraz and disappear into a new life? Or did they perish in the freezing waters of the bay? Let me know your theory in the comments below. I would love to hear what do you think.